Hey everyone, and welcome to this month live stream. Just give me a shout out in the chat. I am really excited to see you guys have already started talking in the chat, so I think we're going to have a really fun evening tonight. And well, the topic of today's live stream is tricky fabrics, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately because it's such a like confidence. It sort of almost removes your confidence. It just kind of makes you feel like you're bad at sewing, but actually, in fact, you're actually working with a tricky fabric. So that's the topic of tonight. But now I want you to say hi in the chat. I've already seen a couple of people now. I'm going to read up your names. We have Kyle from New Jersey. Hi, Kyle. We have Duncan from Summer greetings from hot Portsmouth, UK. Yes, we have a massive heat wave here in Europe right now. Even here in the north in Sweden, it has been really warm, but nothing compares to how it's been in the southern Europe. We have Mary from Massachusetts. Always enjoy your live stream. Thank you so much, Mary. We have Jules. She says, well, it's warm here too. Yeah, for sure. And Libby. And she says, I'm so excited I remember the live day. Thank you so much, Libby, for turning up. We're going to have a real fun chat tonight. Howard is from New York, right? Hi, Johanna. And we have Liana from Missouri. We have Susanne here locally from Sweden. We have Krista from the Netherlands. Hi, Krista. We have Yaha from Doha. I don't know what that is, so please tell me. I'm sorry if my geographical skills is not up to par sometimes. And we have Jackie from Florida in Orlando. And we have also Johanna, which actually has the same spelling as I do, Johanna, which is quite unusual. I think a lot of people in England, they usually say Joanna, right? But I have an H in my name, which is the common way you spell it in Sweden, but it's definitely quite an international name for sure. So it's nice to see someone who spells the same way. And if you're curious how I say my name in Sweden, I actually say Johanna. But the fun thing is when I'm speaking in English, I notice that I adapt a more English pronunciation of my name. So I say Johanna, but actually I'm called Johanna. So it's quite a bit different, but you know, it just makes talking smoother if I sort of adapt the English sounding accent on my name as well. And also we have now this is actually fun. Johanna is from Lindon in Västerås. Well, actually, Johanna, I also used to live in Västerås for about 9 years when I was young. So that's really cool to actually find another Johanna from Västerås. And we have Glenda from Canada. Good morning. And we have Kat from Germany. Hello, Kat. Well, as always, we have such a broad range of people watching, which makes it super fun. And this is definitely a conversation that I don't have all the answers for myself about sewing with tricky fabrics, because I am still struggling with this in several areas. So I'd love to keep the conversation going and hear what your struggles are. And, you know, we can help each other out trying to figure out some best practices when it comes to sewing with tricky fabrics. And of course, first, I like to know, what are your struggles when it comes to fabrics? What type of fabric types are you struggling with? I'd love to know, so please tell me in the chat and we'll try to address them together and see if we can figure out some ideas on how to to the best of our abilities sew those fabrics. And I'm going to start off with a little story of my own journey and a lot of the failures when it comes to sewing with tricky fabrics. And we also have more people in the chat now. We have Jenny, and she's new to sewing, currently in fashion school in Doha. Just in case you're wondering, I'm a mother for as well. It looks like you have your hands full there, Jenny. And we have also Katrin Kausis. Hi, Katrin. And well, what I like to say, like the message I like to convey when it comes to sewing with tricky fabrics, is that it's not really a lack of, how should I put it, skills, because I think you can be a pretty proficient sewist and still struggle with a lot of fabrics. And I really had like this aha moment about, I think about 3 or 4 years ago, because one of my sort of arch nemesis is sewing with slippery silks. And this is actually also really annoying, you know, because those fabrics are also quite expensive, and which makes it even more annoying when when the end result looks kind of shoddy, to be honest. It doesn't at least look up to par to one's expectations. So for instance, about 4 years ago, I not for the first time definitely, but somehow I just forgot all the good practices. I made a a sheer silk blouse, and I made like all the mistakes in the book. First of all, one of the most uttermost important things when you're working with slippery fabrics is to make sure that the fabric stays put. So I think the common advice, but I love to your advice, is to use some type of cotton cloth. You know, you can use old linen sheets, any type of fabric as your surface, because that sort of will grab into the fabric. But of course, in the back of my mind, I kind of remember that, but I still ignored it. So I just placed it on my regular cutting mat, and that was the first mistake. And the second mistake I did was that I cut the pieces on fold, which means that the underlayer just slipped around. So I had to recut the color pieces like 2 or 3 times because the one underneath was uneven. I also ended up with uneven layers because I had the not very brilliant idea of cutting both the back piece folded and the front pieces as a double layer, and that obviously works when you're working with like stable cotton fabrics, but it's absolutely, I mean, I'm sure some of you can do it, but to me it was absolute disaster. So I had to trim and trim and trim to get the pieces even. And then the third mistake I did, which is also quite common when you're working with silk, is that you definitely need to let it hang before you hem it, because it tends to weigh down. And if you know cut anything on bias, for instance, you know that it definitely tends to drop and you know, run out of shape. So if you're hemming any type of like flowy fabric, you definitely need to let it hang for a bit and then trim it so that the lines are even. But of course, I mean, I feel so stupid talking about this, because I mean, I've been sewing for over 30 years, but this was like, I think it was no more than 4 years ago. I've actually, if you look back in my video archive, one of the first videos I've done, so it must be 3 years ago. Yeah, 3 years ago. One of the first videos I did actually was about this this blouse, in the part of the video where I talk about this blouse experiment. So of course, because I didn't let it hang, the hem became uneven a little bit, so then I had to trim it and trim it. So all of a sudden, especially the back piece was shorter than the front piece of the blouse, and sometimes that can be a style, but this was not the style I was looking for. And so after this, you know, pretty much, I mean, I've been wearing the blouse up until just recently, because I noticed that it has got ripped in the sleeve, so I had to retire it. But I spoke to a friend of mine who runs a local fabric store here, and you know, she just told me all the steps that I should have done, and I was like, I mean, why didn't I just did the research before, and not instead of just diving into the project? And I'm sure some of you can relate to that, and it's so annoying, especially as I said, because I feel like I should have been more mindful of it. But on the other hand, you know, it's so easy to get overly confident when you're working with those tricky fabrics, and you know, but if I had followed those advices that I talked about now, probably the end result would have been much better. So now I'm going to see on what you say about your fabric challenges. And you said silk is hard for me. Yeah, it definitely is. And we're going to talk a lot about silk, I think. And also how it says needs to hang for at least hours. Yes, 100%. And that is not just true for silk. I mean, if you're working with any type of like lining fabrics, for instance, if you're lining something that is especially cut a little bit on the round, you should definitely also let it hang for a bit. I mean, if you're doing like a circle skirts, again, let it hang. But that's definitely one of the struggles when it comes to working with those shapeless fabrics, that it's so annoying. And Kaczynka says, the cutting under slippery things is amazing tip. I often cut chiffon on wooden floors. Horrors. Well, that sounds really crazy as well, but yeah. Yeah, and Drew says, chiffon scares me. Yeah. So that's definitely a tricky fabric for sure. And so a few of the tips I mentioned, that is really important. So first of all, you definitely need to cut the fabric on a sticky surface. And I'm sure some of you guys can give some other examples, but I know that the advice that I've been giving from several people is to use cotton fabric, any type of how should I put it? It's like sticky fabrics, and you can also try to sandwich some, something in between the layers. But my best tips, and which I do all the time now, and I've also done a video about sewing with tricky fabrics that I've linked to in the description section, is to always cut single layers. I mean, I think this is something we need to reassess, I think, sometimes as home sewers, because you know, if you read any type of pattern instructions, they always have you cutting on the double fold, right? You don't cut like one continuous piece, you always have like half pieces, for instance. I'm sure, and I'm sure, I would love to hear if someone knows, but I'm sure it has like an history. It probably saves fabric, tissue paper when you're producing a paper pattern. There could be other historical reasons for that as well. Whereas in the garment industry, I think for the most part, correct me if I'm wrong, you always cut something folded up. I mean, like a full piece, not just a half piece, and you cut it on a single piece of fabric. Of course, in the garment industry, you might have layers of fabric cutting, you know, because you have like a cutting machine or whatever. But the most important thing, I think, is that you definitely need to make sure that you just have one piece, because that makes a huge difference. Also, remember that pinning can also distort the fabric, because, you know, the second layer will create a little bit of an extra fold. So I think pattern weights could be better occasionally when you're sewing. Also using like a stabilizer, for instance, when, like spray starch is also really good when you're sewing with especially with chiffon fabrics. We have more chiffon skirt people here in the chat. Jenny Yaha says also one tricky fabric is chiffon. I really find it intimidating to work with. Yes, I know it's scary, but it's such a wonderful fabric, because it's such a light, beautiful fabric. So I definitely think that it's worth spending our time learning the best practices and not doing the mistakes that I've done. Libby says, serrated sewing scissors are such a game changer for cutting anything slippery, thin, and otherwise weak. That's a really good suggestion, yeah. Because I think, you know, serrated scissors, you know, like zigzag stitching, the zigzag stitching, those are really good, and definitely something you should have in your cutting stash for sure. And Rode Alkane says, I used to work in the industry and they backed slippery fabric with tissue papers and always single ply. Yeah, tissue paper, that's a really good idea. Thank you so much for that advice as well. And Duncan says, pattern weights and scissors works best for me. And Kyle says, I'm not an expert in this at all, but I use tissue paper and a rotary cutter. I still need to try the spray starch. I sew with slippery fabric like once a year. Yeah, same, because it's the same thing with me, because I find that it exhausts me. But I'm going to talk now about a project that I did, which you might raise some eyebrows. It's different tradition, but you're like, this is actually my wedding dress. Yeah, it's not white, I know, because I'm not done a white wedding, but this is the wedding dress that I made for my marriage. And this, it checks a lot of different boxes when it comes to sewing. Well, I'm gonna slip of this chair so you can see a little bit better here. It looks like this, and this has a lot of challenges, and in particular it has a silk chiffon, right? A nightmare to work with, and which is also one of the most tricky fabrics to work with as well, is silk velvet. And this was actually my second rodeo, I think, with silk velvet. So I had some best practices, but as you can see, this has like very thin, how should I say, like a rolled, I'm lost for word, like a rolled facing, right? It has, but this is hand sewn. Why? And that's definitely think one of the virtues of hand sewing is when you're working with really tricky fabrics, sometimes, you know, you really need to bring out the needle and thread, because I actually tried to do a machine roll hem, but I couldn't get it to work. So I actually spent the time in front of the telly for hours just to stitch these neckline by hand, and by doing so I find that I got a much better result. So sometimes, you know, you definitely need to like reconsider your construction method as well when you're working with slippery fabrics. And secondly, silk fabric, that's an absolute nightmare to sew because it slips all the way. I mean, it cannot stay put because you're obviously sewing with the nappy sides facing, and it kind of slips and goes, and it's absolutely maddening. So I find that I have to baste together the pieces before I sew, and secondly, employing a walking foot, it's definitely beneficial when you're working with silk velvet, because it evens out the feeding of the upper and under layer, which is also a big problem when you're working with silk velvet. So if you try to use that, that can definitely help, I think. I wouldn't say that I'm a master of silk velvet, but my second dress was definitely better than the first one, and hopefully if I do one again. But then again, I seem to make this type of materials like every 5 years or so. And I got married in 2011, so I don't think I've actually sewn anything with silk velvet since then. So yeah, that's my story about that particular issue. And we have some more questions about the we have Lenny from Riga, Latvia. I'm just about to cutting our camise from difficult fabric. Yeah, I feel your pain. Yerb says, I love your wedding dress. Thank you so much. And she says, you should do a video about the dress for us. Yeah, yeah, I should perhaps. But if I do it again, I would definitely vlog it, because it's definitely a mental journey. There were a lot of highs and lows. And I also literally was sewing the dress on the day of the wedding, because that's how bad it was. And Lena says, how do you connect chiffon with a velvet French seam or overlock? That's a good question. I need to remember. Yes, I was actually using a regular sewing machine. It's obviously lined on the inside. So yeah, I wasn't, and also I think I need to check here, because that's a good question. If I serge it or I use zigzag stitch. Yes, I actually, let me see on the inside. Yeah, I actually serge it using a narrow 3-thread coverlock stitch on the inside to keep it from fraying. I think I used that overall, yeah, but I just actually used a regular sewing machine stitch, so that worked actually. But the trick is obviously to control the fabric, and that can be a beast, to be honest, yeah. And let me see here. We also have let's see. Oh, we have so many questions now. I try to get yeah, we talk about French seam as well, because that's obviously a fantastic seam. Duncan and Liana talks about French seams, and those are absolutely crucial when you're working with especially chiffon fabrics. I probably have used it a little bit here as well. Did I? Let me see. Yeah, a little bit in the side seams, I think, on the dress, but it was mostly attached to the bodies using a regular, so it wasn't stitched so much in the seams, because the piece of chiffon just covers the bust area, and then it sort of was joined at the corset bodies basically. But yeah, absolutely, French seams are the number one seam for me, at least, when you're sewing with chiffon fabrics. There are lots of different ways to do it. You can do it the traditional way, and you can also do like a combination where you serge and then stitch over, because that is also helpful when it comes to fraying. And there are lots of different ways. On the blog somewhere, on a really old blog post, I have another method, which is like a cheating way of doing French seams, which I actually employ sometimes because I'm a bit too impatient. I don't really like to sew fabric and then cut it away like you do with the French seam, because it takes a little bit extra time. And to be honest, I have a hard time cutting straight. So I like to employ a method where I don't really have to cut away fabrics. And pressing, oh yeah, how is this? I think being open about what method is to be used, a complete garment, is very important. Sometimes the old-fashioned hand sewing method needs to be used, absolutely. And I think this Howard brings up a really good point, and which is also one of the reasons why I want to do this live stream about this topic, is that it's definitely something that I think we need to talk about and share more, because sometimes, especially in these times, I think of Instagram, where you don't really get to see so much of the behind-the-scenes stuff. It's super easy to assume that this beautiful dress in this wonderful silk fabric or some other type of fabric was sort of magically put together by someone that was super accomplished, and it was a breeze. And then you look at your own struggles and you're like, aha, like why are my seams like wonky, and they like have wrinkles, and they are not even, when this other person, when this like tiny square, and you're like, oh, that's such a beautiful finish. And definitely what this is like one of my missions about doing the sewing content I do, is that we definitely talk about this, because there are so many tricks that we need to know in order to achieve those results, and oftentimes we don't see the entire story if we just see a completed garment. And I think it's so important to know that these fabrics, A, are hard, and B, there are good practices that you can vastly improve the result, but you definitely need to have like a different approach, if that makes sense, compared to like sewing cotton shirting. And that is why it's so important. So if you end up having to hand sew, for instance, like I did in this case, then that's what you have to do. You know, just make it work for you, because there's definitely no right and no wrong. Because it is hard. It definitely is hard to sew with silk and chiffon fabrics. And Libby also talks about pressing velvet so specialized. How did you do it? I wanted to buy a needleboard, but they're so expensive. Yeah, Libby, yeah, that's really hard. I actually used a lot of steam, because I found that advice. I have an old sewing book from the 30s, and those are actually, if you get your hands on those old sewing books, speaking about good techniques, those actually tackle this type of issues much better than modern sewing books, I find. So, for instance, I have a couple of really old sewing books, one from the 30s and one from the 50s, and both these talk in depth about, for instance, silk velvet. And the advice there is that you, if you have a seam, you don't actually use the pressing board. Now I'm going to be super technical. You have to be aware of me now, but this is such a technical question. Instead, what you do, because what happens if you just press on the cutting board, the wonderful, beautiful nappy outside will be pressed flat, and that's not what you want. So what the book advised me to do was, and I'm going to turn around, is that you attach the fabric on the iron board with a needle, and then you actually stretch out the fabric like this. So you hold it like this. Hope this makes sense. So the skirt, for instance, is actually in the hanging in the air, so to speak, and then you use an iron and lightly press it with lots of steam. And this, so you press against the seam, but not against any firm surface. I hope this makes sense. It sounds crazy perhaps, but it works, because I think in the case of silk velvet, it's more important to not harm the texture of the fabric rather than having super flat, hard pressed seam, if that makes sense. And this, I know this sounds crazy, but I've done it with 2 dresses, and I did a blog post about this perhaps like in 2010 or something like that. If you find it in my blog archive, it's probably hidden in the basement somewhere, unless I've deleted it because it was so badly formatted. But I've done a blog post about this method many years ago when I did another silk velvet dress. So I hope that makes sense. And we also have another tip for pressing velvet here from Liana. She says, as for to pressing velvet, I keep it brutally simple. I press on a terry towel. That's also really good, because again, you add that layer between the pressing board and the fabric. But not sure if it's right, but it works for me, and you know, it works for that works. And we have more people here I just missed some to say hi. Sorry if I missed a couple of people now saying hi, because I try to keep up with the chat now and keeping all the train of thoughts in my head. But hi, Sandra from Nashville, and I also saw that we have some other people in the chat as well. I probably missed that, but hi everyone. Sorry if I missed you earlier. So these are some tips when it comes to sewing with silk velvet and silk chiffon and shears. And another thing that is super common, which if you are hemming silk, for instance, now I would probably butcher this word because I can't remember it, but when you're hemming, especially if the fabric is a tiny little on the round, you will notice that you will oftentimes get drag lines, like diagonal drag lines along the hem, because again, a problem is the uneven feeding. And when you're working with the slippery fabrics, you know, apparently all sorts of things are happening between the presser foot and the feed dogs. Bad things are happening. This is, I think, you can try to use a walking foot if you have problems with that, for sure. And another tip that I find is that what has helped me the most is to manipulate the fabric, and that's not as woo as it sounds, but what I like to do is that I've talked about this so many times, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but it's still a very good method. Because the problem is that the feeding of the feed dog and the presser foot is uneven. So you need something, and what I do is I use an awl like this, and then when I'm sewing, so the presser foot moves like this, right? And then I gently press the upper layer of the fabric like this in a rhythmic motion, and I stitch quite slowly, so I have plenty of time, right, to press and press and press, and just push the fabric towards it. And this, I swear to you, this is a miracle worker. I mean, it's not very high tech. It doesn't require an expensive walking foot. Just require a cheap tool. You can also use like a big needle, any sharp tool, whatever. And I find this especially when you're working with curves and like or satin fabrics. I mean, even cotton fabrics, you'll sometimes run into this problem, especially if the hem is curved. Just using this, I mean, I'm not saying that it will magically make this problem disappear on all fabrics, but if you also combine this with a dose of spray starch on the hem, yeah, 100% you will get a much better result, especially if you're doing like soft silk, like underwear, you know, with you want to have those narrow hem. Using a little bit of spray starch, again, only spray starch if you're planning to wash the silk fabric in water, and of course you have to pre-wash to check. So this is not like an definitely not something situation I can recommend always, but if you plan to wash the fabric in water, you can definitely do spray starch. And secondly, and most important, is to use this. You can also use your finger, and I'm sure some people are like very proficient with their hands. They can also, you know, like manipulate the fabric a little bit. So this is like my new thing, and I've been doing that for a few years now. It's just, you know, always like controlling the fabrics and really sort of feel it, and it's kind of like almost like hypnotic feeling, to be so concentrated and so focused. Like I try to be like one with the sewing machine, if that makes sense. I know I sound really woo-woo tonight, but I'm sorry. But just being that mindful about it, that has made a massive difference. Instead of being like, you know, the pedal to the metal and bar, the metal, and just boom, 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 boom. I find that when you're doing this tricky hems, just being mindful is like a massive, big game changer. Absolutely. Also, we have another suggestion here about pressing silk velvet. Rhoda Alkeny says you can also use a piece of velvet scrap as pressing cloth for velvet. Kennedy King's Cool Couture recommends a type of upholstery fabric that they can't recommend the name of. That sounds really clever as well. I can imagine any type of fabric, or like you said previously, terry cloth, any type of fabric that gives the sort of buffer between the pressing board and a smooth surface definitely helps as well. And Howard says, I use long tweezers to every machine. I use like you use or all just to push the fabric through. Yeah, this is also, I mean, such a game changer. I mean, seriously, just have any type of good tweezer. It also helps you with threading and, you know, removing lint. There are so many good uses, and you can also use it to insert needles, for instance. I mean, there's so many good ways. So always have a tweezer and an awl. You can also use the rip seams if you want to. Great tool, always have it by your side. And also Kate has another good suggestion as well. She says the Wonder Tape has been a game changer for me. I think we talked about this a lot before, but this is this is Wonder Tape. This is Wonder Tape. It's a double-sided tape that is water soluble. Again, super useful if you have problems with like fabric slippage. You attach it, and then when you wash, the tape dissolves. Problem solved. Great tool. I mean, it's super useful for knits as well. Says great tip about the awl. Thank you. Yeah, I should definitely get a percentage, because I feel like I've been talking about the virtues of having an awl in like half of the content I've been doing. I have lots of videos and blog posts about this as well. But I mean, yeah, it is really good tool. And I want to talk about another topic as well, which I am definitely not an expert, and I really like to hear your thoughts about this. And that is sewing with leather and other type of dense fabrics, or not fabrics, dense materials that doesn't behave like regular fabrics, because I'm definitely not an expertise in this. I think I've sewn a couple of things in synthetic leathers, and like 20 years ago I made a small project just using leather, but that's as to the extent of my knowledge. So I'd love to hear you guys' experience with leather, what type of presser foot you find useful. If you, for instance, if you use tape or glue, how do you keep the material, in place? Another tip that I should say though, and it's definitely useful regardless of material, is to use these wonder clips. I can assume, if you correct me if I'm wrong, I know Kylie, for instance, in the chat, she's a fantastic bag maker, and I'd love to hear if your thoughts about the wonder clips as well for this purpose, but I think I've seen you use it. Those are really great. They obviously don't hurt the material, they keep it in place, and I know also some people like to tape the seams, right, when you're sewing with leather fabric. So I'm really curious to hear if you have any best practices about that. Do you use like a regular foot, do you use a Teflon foot, or is it some particular leather presser foot perhaps? So I'd really love to know, because that's definitely not an area of expertise about this. Kate says using a non-stick presser foot is critical with leather. Yeah, that's this one. This is a version of this. This is a Teflon foot, but I bought a generic one, so it's not great. But that's really, really good when you're working with any type of sticky fabrics. So that's really good to know. And yeah, so those are definitely some of the struggles. And also when you're working with a lot of bulky layers, which, for instance, if you're sewing with leather and then you add like those heavy duty interfacings, and then you have like an issue sometimes with how the machine will behave. So I'd really like to hear your thoughts about this as well. One thing that I find really helpful when I'm sewing over bulky seams, but couldn't find it now, but is to use a hammer to actually I bought this it's like a black rubber hammer, so it's not like a regular metal hammer, but it's a black, and I use this, and I use like a tree like a cutting board, and then I place the bulky seams on top of that, and then I just give them some banging, right? And this is definitely something I found useful when it comes to sewing over bulky seams. It can definitely be instance, especially if you're using thick fabrics and also using like thick materials that isn't like very easy to sew over. So yeah. We have more thoughts here about the leather situation. Sarah says Teflon foot for leather and leather needles, as well as tape the seams in clothing. Yeah, that's really good to know. Thank you so much, Sarah. And Kyle says wonder clips, but don't leave them on for a week or anything like that. Teflon foot super slider adhered to the bed of the sewing machine so the leather doesn't get stuck on the machine. Yeah, that's one of the things I've noticed when I've sewn with these type of materials, is that they don't really feed as nicely as regular fabrics. I mean, it's not just an issue about the presser foot, right? It's also how the feed dogs behave as well. So that's really good. I've not heard of this super slider, but I'm really curious about that product. I always get so many good tips from you guys. But I assume, Kyle, right, that the super slider is something that you place on the bed, which creates like a smoother surface for the fabric to move, right? Or the leather. I mean, it's not a fabric. Sorry. And Kate says, my machine came with a tool for bulky seams. It's a thick piece of plastic that you used before and after the seam. Yeah, that's a really good point, Kate. This is one of those. This is the one that came with my machine. I love the words for this. It's either called, right, Gigamig in English, Gigamig, or something like that. And the other one is hump jumper, right? You have such a great words for these. In Sweden, it was just called like lever racer, I think. But just like Kate says, you insert these to level the presser foot, because one of the reasons you will have problems when sewing over bulky seams is because the presser foot is like, it has to go uphill or downhill, and that doesn't create a smooth seam. And if you're sewing over knits, for instance, that is a skip stitched guaranteed to be happen, and also that can happen on regular sewing machine as well, which is why you use this type of tools to level up. This is not the common ones, but the other ones, they look quite different, but they all do the same thing, right? That they elevate the presser foot so it's even, and that's so important when you're sewing over bulky seams. And Kyle says, I used to use tissue paper. Speaking, Kyle, again, going back to the point of what you use on the bed of the machine to make the leather feed smoothly. Kyle says, I use a tissue paper, but the super slide is so much easier than picking the tissue paper out of the stitching. Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, tissue paper. I've done that too, just like Kyle says. And it really is a mess to get rid of. So I would definitely prefer to use some type of water-soluble material rather than tissue paper, but I've been there. So the Super Slider seems like an excellent product. And Super Slider was made for quilters. Yes, makes it really slick. Yeah, good find. Thank you so much for the tip. And it's called Ginamijig. Sorry, I butchered that word. Howard corrects me. Ginamijig. Yeah, it's a fantastic word. I would love to hear the origin of that word because it's really, really funny. And also, let me see if we have more. Yeah, more talk about the mallet. Julie said mallet uses mallet as well. Is that the word as well for this, or were you referring to something else? But definitely invest in one of those, and don't think that they look like these because they usually don't. But if you don't, if not familiar with this tool, search for Giamig or Hump Jumper, and you will find the tools that you can use for this. Absolutely. And also, Duncan has a great tip on hammer, Thor hammers, which is a great word, obviously, for a hammer brand. They have interchangeable heads for different materials. That sounds really interesting as well. I had no idea, actually, that you could get hammers with interchangeable, like, hammer bits. And also, Kate speaking about, the using tissue paper or some other type of material to get good stitching. Kate says, tear away or wash away embroidery stabilizers works a little better. Traditional tissue paper when it comes to removal. Yeah, 100%. I've also some wash away stabilizer in my stash. And it's also really good when you're sewing with knit sometimes if it's super tricky, especially if you're using a regular sewing machine. Can work. But yeah, tissue paper is a little bit of a risk. It's in all the sewing books I've seen it been recommended. It's probably why I've also tried it a lot, but I've never really successfully felt like it was easy to remove afterwards. It tends to get stuck underneath the thread. So yeah, that's really another really good tip to have. What else? Yes, I want to talk about another fabric that can actually, another type of fabric which actually can be super tricky to sew, and that is knit fabrics. Because knit fabrics, they are probably the most unpredictable fabrics, because obviously if you're working with, say, silk chiffon or crepe de chine, you kind of know what you're in for, right? You know that it will be a little bit tricky, but the challenges are consistent. But when you're sewing with stretchy knit fabrics, you can have all sorts of struggles. I mean, seriously, I mean, I sew a lot with knits, and I'm still regularly humbled by the challenges of sewing with knits. So a couple of advice there specifically is that if you're encountering, like, I think we all noticed it, have all experience with this fabric. It's the sort of fabric that just grows and grows. For instance, it can be like a soft rib fabric, or it doesn't lend itself to any type of hemming technique. I mean, even if you have a cover stitch machine, it still doesn't work because the seam is not flat, it doesn't look nice, it curls. I mean, it's just a mess. And my advice is, if you end up with this sort of absolutely super difficult knit fabrics, don't try to fight it too much, because I'm going to give you an example now. About 2 years ago, maybe 1.5 years ago, I did a workout top using like a soft merrill that's like a wick-away fabric, and I couldn't get it to hem right. I mean, I would say I'm really good at using cover stitch machine. I mean, I even done a book about how to use the cover stitch machine, but I still couldn't get my cover stitch machine to hem this fabric in a manner that I felt was satisfactory. So, lesson learned. So the next time I used the fabric, because I had more fabric, was that instead I was like, no, I'm not hemming in this. Instead, I am using other methods to finish the seam. So instead I added cuffs on the sleeves, right? This is how the top looks like for reference. I hope you can see how it looks. So I used cuffs for the sleeves, and look, the waistband, again, folded cuffs, no hemming. I did use the cover stitch, for instance, to stitch down the net. That works really fine because the net added some stability, and also I've cover stitched down the neckband, which is the same fabric. Again, that worked. So it was only, the problem was when I was only stitching the actual fabric. Then is when I got those wonky seams, I got ridges, I got drag lines, and then so this, sometimes you have to be like, you can't fight the fabric, right? You have to let the fabric tell you, like, listen to the fabric, and be like, okay, this is not the sort of fabric that I'm going to do the same type of method I often use. So the same goes for sometimes when it comes to hemming, when you're hemming silk fabrics, very loose woven fabric, you should definitely try to do like a rolled hem. For instance, if you have a serger, then you're definitely good for gold. You can do a rolled hem on the serger. You can also try to use like a narrow hem on the sewing machine, but that can be tricky. You can also try to use like a scallop edge, just using folded in and covered with zigzag stitch. And sometimes, especially when you're sewing with knits, you know, it's nothing wrong. There's absolutely nothing wrong with leaving a seam raw, because knits doesn't unravel. So if you end up, you know, not being able to solve it in a satisfactory manner, then it's fine. You can add, as I did, a piece of cuff. You can also add like stretch lace if that's your thing. But you should definitely be mindful about the fact that some knit fabrics are simply not meant to be hemmed. They need to be finished in some other type of manner, and that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So I'm speaking to myself here, but I'm really agitated about this, but because it's something I've made the mistake so many times myself, is that you don't really need to do everything the same way always. It's fine to be like, oh, but this doesn't work. It doesn't reflect on your capabilities or your sewing machines for that matter. It's just that the fabrics is such hard to use any type of traditional hemming methods, because hemming is probably the one that is most tricky when it comes to those knit fabrics. Now I got off on my soapbox, sorry, but I definitely feel very passionate about this topic. And we have more people suggesting in the chat now. And Nard says, but speaking about leathers, going back to that topic again, Nard says, I sew leathers and reclaimed real fur. Teflon foot is a must, and Wonder Tape, especially where seams interact. I do not use an iron, but a steam machine. Thank you so much for that tip. That's also super valuable to know. And speaking of cutting knits, Kate says, I usually prefer to cut knits with a rotary cutter exclusively. Same. I definitely think, because that doesn't prevent the friction. It's just to stay flat. But when you sort of work with scissors, it tends to sort of change the fabric. I mean, you sort of move it around. But if you have pattern weights, if you have a rotary cutter, that's much easier. And we have Diana from South Carolina. Hi, Diana. It's your first time tuning in. Welcome so much. And Nard says, needs to be completely dry before continuing. Time management necessary, but it works. And that was about the steam machine, right, Nard? And Howard says, any single knit jersey type is a horror. Yeah, it is. It's super difficult. And to be honest, you know, if it's any type of stretch, I would say that you definitely probably need to use a serger, because then you can control it with the differential feed and the way the feed dogs, and the press foot will just prevent even feeding, will create an even feeding compared to sewing machine, because you will run into problems. And sometimes, yeah, a cover stitch machine, to be honest, on some knits, that's the only machine that will give you satisfactory result when it comes to some stretchy single jerseys, especially those light ones. So yeah, if you're just having a sewing machine and you're working with those really shapeless single knit fabrics, don't feel bad, because it's not really designed to work with those fabrics. So you will have some challenges. I'm hate to break it to you, but yeah, definitely a serger especially is a real game changer when you're working this fabric. And And you says it's a thingamajig when you can't remember what something is called. Thingamajig, that I will remember. Thank you so much, Jules. Nora says also use a wooden stick, a dowel to press down directly on the seam, so no indentation on the right side of the leather. Thank you so much. I love you're so experienced about these, you guys. It's so nice because that's the cool thing about doing this live stream, because I learn a ton as well. And you guys hopefully a lot as well, so we can just share, because we all have our different areas of expertise. So it's really good. I feel like I'm really getting really excited about sewing with leather now, and I'm getting so many tips. I also feel less scared about that particular material, which I've been kind of scared about. Yeah. And Kate says, yes, listen to the fabric. Yeah, this is like the big aha moment I think that we all will have at some point, right? That the fabric, it just tells a story of how we should behave and what pattern we should use, what machines we will use, what seams we use. And as soon as we try to fight the fabric with some fancy methods, then we usually end up being kind of disappointed with the end result. And Mary Rapp says, I recently returned to garment sewing, so I appreciate all the wonderful information. Thank you. Thank you so much. That means a lot to hear, Mary. And you said there's always so much to learn with sewing. I find it so fascinating. Same, yeah. I mean, that's a mind-blowing thing. I mean, I started sewing garments when I was 11, and I'm turning 47 now. So I've been sewing pretty much consistently for 36 years now, and I'm still learning so much. I mean, it doesn't really go. I mean, sometimes even with each sewing project, I have this little aha moments where I think, next time I will do this a little bit different. So that's probably one of the reasons why you don't get bored with sewing, because I'm really curious about that as well. Because I know some of you say you return to sewing, because I found that sewing is one of those hobbies that I've never really gotten bored with. And I wonder if you would agree with me, is one of the reasons it's such a creative outlet, right? And we also get to use the stuff that we make in a way that we don't always get with other craft. But I also think that the fact is that it's such a continuous learning experience, and we keep expanding our skills. It doesn't really get old, because there are always new patterns, new materials, new ideas, new fashion that we want to try. And, you know, because most of us, I think, perhaps start with easy projects, then we suddenly feel like, oh, we want to make like a pair of jeans or a tailored jacket. And especially now with the sewing internet, it's like we can get together so much and learn from each other in a way which, as to me especially, it has opened like a whole new world. I mean, I've learned so much more now in the last, say, 15 years that I've been acting on the sewing internet compared to the over 20 years before that, because I wasn't part of a community where you share knowledge like this. So I definitely think that, you know, that's one of the appeal for me, you know, when it comes to sewing, is it's such a constant learning process, and with each project there's some new thing you're like, I should have done that instead. So that's one of the fascinating thing about that. And Duncan says going slow does help overcome some of the problems. Yes, that's Duncan, you bring up such a great point as well, again, about the mindset thing. I think that we are so, it's easy to think, again, I think there's like, first of all, when you compare ourselves to a garment factory, because they have like an assembly line situation, of course they will be fast. Secondly, some people are obviously faster than others, but when we're only sewing for ourselves, there's no value in sewing fast. I think for me, it's much more important to sew right than sew fast. Just like Duncan says, sewing slowly, it just makes everything more, you gain more control, and it's more like a conscious sewing situation, instead of thinking like, okay, now I have 2 hours, now I'm going to finish this garment, you know, rain or shine, it has to happen. I think that's like, it's been like a real big game changer for me to not approach sewing that way. And Kate has one more tip about leather here as well. And leather doesn't fray, so you can't overlap seams for flat seam, wrong side to right. Yeah, that's a really nice tip as well. Thank you, Kate, because that obviously creates those flat butted seams, which looks so nice. And Howard says, and Howard, he's a veteran sewing. If you head over to my blog, thelaststitch.com, you can actually find an interview I did with Howard. And he is a true veteran for sure. And he says there's always so much to learn. I've been sewing since 1960, and so many new ideas come to light all the time. Yeah, and that's so encouraging to hear, because you've been sewing for, I mean, over 20 years longer than I have, Howard, and you still learn new things. I find that so inspirational. And Duncan says, sewing gives us styles, not ones fed by the industry, and the right fit too. Yeah, that's a good point as well, Duncan. Being able to actually get the garment to fit your body, because obviously most of us will not fit exactly into the very standardized measurements that the sizing that the big fashion industry have, because they have to operate on a different level. We can actually make clothes that fits our bodies and not the masses. So that's really one of the absolute values when it comes to sewing. So it's such a powerful, it's such a powerful hobby. And the more I think about it, it's like it has so many dimensions. Body positivity, body acceptance. There are so many things when it comes to sewing that I find so beneficial. Now I'm getting a bit off the topic of difficult materials, but my point is that we have to be mindful about the things that it can be a bit tricky, but it's also a lot about learning techniques and also being taking it slow, try out things. And another good point about sewing with tricky fabrics is that do samples, especially with the stitching, because that I find tricky fabrics, you have to perhaps experiment with the stitch length when you're stitching over, for instance, when you're hemming, you might need to see what works best for that. There's so many things that you definitely should work tension settings, especially again if you're using a serger or cover stitch machine, and also of course sometimes with the sewing machine as well, you need to experiment a little bit with tension to get it right, because tricky fabrics have their own way of behaving for sure. So those are definitely one of the also really important things. And do you have any more sort of difficult fabrics that you want to vent about? So please tell in the chat, and we'll do our best to address it, because it definitely is a topic that has a lot of nuances to it. But definitely, as we talked about, getting it to stabilize. And I think I am more and more becoming, how should I put it? I'm becoming more and more less of a fan of using pins. Now, you can definitely disagree with me on that once we keep the conversation going, but I have found some issues with pinning, because again, if you look at a lot of older sewing pattern instructions, a lot of older sewing pattern books, they have you pin, very closely and a lot. And the problem with pinning, I find that, especially if you're not super proficient with it, is that it can distort the fabric, especially the underlayer, because the way you pin. And also, of course, it's super important to remove the pins before you approach, right, with the needle, so you don't want to break the needle. That can be super dangerous, and it can also blunt the needle. So I find that when you're working with tricky fabrics, I'm strongly against overpinning. Now, that could be just me, but I'm definitely a big believer of that, and I say that because I have a lot of experience, so I'm definitely not talking out of my hat, but I'm sure other people will disagree with me. So I would much rather use these Wonder Clips, for instance, just like we talked about, like the highly used for leather. And I would definitely also use Wonder Tape much more. And good old hand basting. I'm a big fan of hand basting as well, because that is the perfect combination of control, but still has a little bit of a movement. Because if you don't, I'm not big a fan of hand basting like super tight. I like to use quite loose stitches, quite long stitches, so there's still a little bit of movement when you're sewing, but it keeps the fabric in place. So these are my preferred method, much more of a needle. So if that's an issue as well, you should definitely look into it, see if using, say, Wonder Clips or some other type of way of keeping the fabric can actually help. And also, once you get more accustomed to using this sewing with these tricky fabrics, I find that for instance, when I was sewing my second project with silk velvet, I found that I got a little bit better, manipulating the fabric and keeping steady with my hands, because the first time it was like all over the place, but the second time I had sort of gotten a bit better feeling on how to handle the fabric while I was sewing. So that's also something you should definitely investigate. And we have some thoughts about the pinning now. Libby says, I sew almost completely without pins. With special techniques, it's so much faster and more accurate. Yeah, that's really good to know, Libby, that you have also come to this conclusion, because I think that's definitely one of those advices that are very much all over the place, but it's not always 100% the best way to do it. And Kate says, I also agree on overpinning. Rhoda says, any tips for sewing heavy laces like guipere lace? I should have spelled it wrong. Well, I did. I've sewn a couple of pieces in guipere. I have 3 years of French, but you wouldn't. Guipere. Sorry, I bullshit. But yeah, those are definitely tricky. I personally have actually used mostly hand sewing when sewing those thick corded laces. But I've also noticed that you can use a regular sewing machine. It works, but definitely I've tried to use like a little bit a longer stitch length. I also sometimes try to use a zigzag stitch, and not like a full zigzag stitch, but a narrow zigzag stitch. So you definitely need to find what works. But sometimes on these lace types, the surface is so uneven that I found that using a sewing machine doesn't really feed the lace. So then I have used hand sewing. So that's my tips, because that's what we do in the couture as well. So it probably works. Borja says, any tips for fabric like Lion, Silk Nine? Yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts about that as well, because when you're sewing with rain fabrics and stuff, I have a couple of tips. I use a Microtex needle, not a regular sewing needle, because that definitely helps with the piercing of nylon. Using glide-on foot helps a lot. You can also try, I would definitely use wonder clips and not needles when sewing with nylon. So I think there are also a lot of the tips here that comes for leather is, I think, very much true when you're working with nylon as well. So I hope, Borja, if that answers your questions, but definitely use some type of Microtex needles. I think it's the biggest thing, and having like a gliding presser foot for sure. And Duncan says, I love hand basting, it's very sensitive. Yeah, that's really nice. Sometimes I like to sit in the sofa and sew by hand, because I find it so much more relaxing than sitting hunched in front of my sewing machines. And Dana says, Wagner, I'm definitely a fan of basting, that gives me more control. I have hand tremors, so I need the control. Yeah, I can understand that. Yeah, definitely. Because it's also hard, because, you know, if your hands are not working properly always, you definitely also need to have tools in order to, because obviously sewing is such a precision thing. So definitely I can understand that you know, having good hand control is such a crucial thing. And Angela says, I always have problems with satin type fabrics. My seams end up wavy. I tried holding the fabric taut as I'm sewing, but it doesn't always work. Hems are even tricky. Yeah, for sure. Taut sewing is a really good idea. Angela, the method I talked about earlier, using an awl to feed the upper layer of the satin fabric, helps a lot. I was super successful when I used this when I did a satin blouse, I think about a year ago. I used an awl pretty much for all the seams. That made a huge difference. And also Lynn says also I rarely use pins anymore. And you says, thank you so much for all the awesome tips. Elena says, yes, what's the trick for satin so it's not wavy? Yeah, this is the trick. The gentle, you sew here, and then you use the awl to rhythmically press the fabric towards this. This will remove a lot of the wavy thing. And I think you can also use this using your fingers. But I will say that if you don't do something, you will end up with wavy satin fabrics. And even if some satin fabrics, even if you use this method or some other ways to control the waviness, you will still end up with slightly wavy. And you can also look even higher end satin ready-to-wear garments will have that wavy thing. So it's not something that just we struggle with. It's just the properties of the fabric. I think also that's really like a good confidence boost. Sometimes I like to check out ready-to-wear, especially in the high-end scale. And if I can see that they are also struggling with some of these tricky fabrics, that actually makes me feel better. So, well, it's actually 9 o'clock now here in Sweden, and it's time to round out the chat. Well, I'm super thankful that all you guys went by and chatted with me. This was absolutely fantastic. I've learned so much, and I've also got really excited about sewing with leather now because I got learned so much from you guys. So that's really, really good. And I hope that you learned something as well. I will try to link some of the things that I've talked about in the description section if I can remember it, but you can also head over to my blog, thelaststitch.com, where you can search for silk velvet, you can search for all, and so probably a lot of French seams as well, because all those things I have blogged about previously. Also, I forgot to mention one final tip, because that was what I'm going to talk about. When you're sewing with having problems with skip stitches, you should definitely, when you're hemming, you should definitely consider clipping the seam. And I've talked about this before as well, and it's also in my books, Sewing Activewear and Master the Cover Stitch Machine. And what you do here, and you can use this for woven as well, you flip this, right, opposite direction, then you have a much less bulky seam. It's even, you won't have that issue with the presser foot being all, you know, up and down like this. So this is a big tip that you should definitely investigate. Of course, you need to make sure that the seam is stable enough to withstand this, but if you're using like a 4-thread serger thread, no problems. If you're using elastic stitch on your sewing machine or a zigzag stitch, no problem. A straight stitch, no problem. So yeah, try this, it will make a big difference. So that's my final tips now for the oh yeah, so everyone, thank you so much, and we have some thank you everyone says thank you so much, and always a pleasure to visit with you. Joanna says Howell, thank you so much, and treat as always. Joanna, thank you so much. Duncan, and guess I need to rewatch this as I have to run away from PC for a while, but anyways, with lovely time as always. Thank you so much. And Borges says thank you for doing these live streams, really helpful. By the way, I must try the voodoo technique, being one with the machine. Yes, thank you again. That's the big thing, right? And now the live streams will take a bit of a summer vacations. I will be back in the fall with my monthly live stream, the last Sunday of most month. Otherwise, I will notify you in some ways. So stay tuned, and I'll be back in the fall with more sewing topics that I want to tackle. And I wish you all a great summer. And I'm really looking forward to chat with you again in the fall, where I have some more exciting news to share with you guys as well. So have a fantastic summer or winter, depending on where on the globe you're living. And I'll talk to you next time. Bye bye.